Hello, my name is John McStravick and I'm head of the content team at DeHavilland. Welcome to our most recent video conversation. This time we're talking about the new Labour leadership and the new Shadow Cabinet. I've got two excellent guests who many of you will be familiar with to discuss that today. First, I have David Wild, who is the founder and chair of Lodestone Communication. Thank you for joining us, David. And I also have with us Christine Quigley. She's Director of Public Affairs at Newington Communications and a former advisor to the Labour Party. Thank you for joining us. I understand it's your birthday, Christine, so an extra special thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
The pubs may be shut, but there's plenty to discuss with DeHavilland instead.
Absolutely.
So to kick us off, let's have a sort of overarching question. So Keir Starmer's come in. He's got, on the face of it, a lot of support within at least the Labour Party membership, won in the first round. How much of a change are the two of you expecting to see early doors compared with the Cormid administration, the way they ran things and the way they arranged policy? David, let's kick off with you.
I'd say there's already been quite a significant change. I was talking to people yesterday about, how Keir has been organising and then running the Shadow Cabinet, and he's a lot younger man. He's going to be in charge. We'd all got used to Jeremy basically operating almost as a cipher for others, and it's been like that for years, and that's just how people have got used to the Labour Party operating. That will be very different. Keir will be much more hands-on, much more driving things. So in terms of style, he will be a proper leader, and that will be quite a big difference. Never mind before we even come to policy.
I'd say in that I agree. I think we're already seeing some really big shifts, but a kind of key thing for business to bear in mind is that, particularly in policy terms, we're going to see evolution rather than revolution. So I think it's fair to say that some businesses were not terribly keen on the prospect of Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. It certainly wouldn't be helpful to be engaging with new Shadow Cabinet members by saying, we're delighted Jeremy's no longer leader, isn't this exciting? I think we should be expecting to see continuity in some of the key policies as Keir is trying to kind of triangulate between the left and the centre left of the party. And I think we're going to see some of the policy positions evolve over the next year or 18 months.
And what other actors should we bear in mind as that policy does evolve rather than have a revolution? So it kind of went under the radar slightly, but we also had the NEC elections on Saturday, and there were some changes there. This morning, Momentum have said they're rebranding as Forward Momentum. So public affairs professionals, do they need to have those changes on their radar as well?
But I would say that to go down a rabbit hole of the hard left descending into factional is more for the specialist. I would say that in terms of businesses, it is a big deal what happened at the NEC, but what it means really that Keir has established an absolute hegemony over the whole party. What it means is that the GMB basically have the casting votes at NEC. And when all's said and done, the Shadow Cabinet is going to be evolving policy. The NEC has much more to do with how the party is run, and obviously the very significant issue of how Keir cleans up the anti-Semitism fiasco, frankly, from the previous regime.
Yeah, I think the NEC is absolutely worth keeping an eye on, but I think for most businesses, you're right, you wouldn't be expecting kind of direct lobbying of the NEC. The people on the NEC you would expect to be engaging with as a public affairs professional are people you'd be engaging with anyway, so kind of members of the Shadow Cabinet and parliamentarians in particular. What should be quite interesting actually over the next few months is keeping an eye on what some of the Labour's affiliated socialist societies are doing. So CERA, who's Labour's environment campaign, have got a really big programme of activity over the next few months, which they were hoping to do in the run-up to COP26. I think they'll still be focusing on that. There are other groups like Labour Business, for example, who actually in themselves can be quite influential in terms of shaping policy and shaping kind of some of the party's thinking. So I think particularly for some of the new Shadow Cabinet members and people who maybe have moved into new briefs, it'll be really interesting to just keep an eye on what some of the social societies in their areas are doing. Because actually that could be quite a good way to keep them informed.
Great. That's a nice segue to what I want to talk about next, which is the Shadow Cabinet. So we saw an awful lot of change, perhaps unsurprisingly, from the group that were in beforehand. Looking at the appointments that have been made, were any surprises, and who do you see as being the winners and losers from this, either individuals or in terms of factions of the party, perhaps also in terms of some of the sectors as well, business sectors?
Sure. I'm really excited about seeing Annelies Dodds as Shadow Chancellor, actually. I think a lot of people outside the Labour movement were maybe a bit surprised. She hasn't been terribly high profile in the media, but she's somebody that's got great credibility from across the Labour Party. She's sort of very much on the soft left, but she's kind of really well respected by people all across the party, particularly from her previous role where she was Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury. Was doing a lot of work with John McDonnell around increasing productivity, regional productivity. She is super smart. She's only been an MP since 2017, but has a really strong hinterland in public policy. It was previously an MEP. And I think she's going to make some really big changes. She's also, I think, the first ever female Shadow Chancellor.
That's right, yeah.
I would say the return of Rachel Reeves is significant. She was one of the people who was basically out on the backbenchers, made a good name for herself in the select committee system. So Rachel being back, obviously big headline is Ed Miliband being back. And frankly, that speaks exactly to what's already been said about how policy will evolve rather than change massively. Ed was known as that pro-business, even when he was Secretary of State. And I would say a word for the youngest and member of the Shadow Cabinet, Louise Haigh, sneaked in at Northern Ireland, and that is always a very good training ground for going further up the greasy pole, because Northern Ireland obviously involves some international diplomatic activity. It's obviously very tricky on the ground. The politics of Northern Ireland are quite specialist. So she's definitely one to watch. But overall, it's quite these terms are obviously very flexible, but it's a soft left cabinet, shadow cabinet. It's the kind of shadow cabinet that Ed himself would have appointed if he thought he could have got away with it. And it's all in a way that the previous leadership never was. You've got to remember that as soon as Jeremy was leader, Tom Watson was deputy leader. And as far as the right and the centre of the party were always in behind Tom. Whereas now, Keir gets a pretty clear run at the situation. And, the shadow cabinet reflects that.
And they're quite a callous... Sorry, Christine, go ahead.
No, I think it's been really interesting as well to see that there are various people who've been promoted into the Shadow Cabinet who were shadow ministers under Corbyn, but not necessarily part of the Corbyn project. But actually, there are also a couple of people in the Shadow Cabinet now who were very close to Jeremy Corbyn. So obviously, Rebecca Long-Bailey taking over the Shadow Education brief, and Kat Smith, for example. So this is not a complete kind of rejection of Corbyn and Corbynism, and something for kind of people to bear in mind as they're kind of continuing to engage with the party, is that actually on a number of areas the difference between the kind of the hard left position and the soft left position may not be massive.
Absolutely,
that's true. But I'd say that the reason for Becky being still in there, it's just very good politics, because that immediately splits the hard left into those who want to engage with Keir and be positive, and those who want to organise an opposition on the side. And I think we will see that especially with regards to the politics around momentum and that. I mean, for the likes of me and Catherine, we I'm sure will take great delight in the ins and outs of it all, and you know, take great pleasure in explaining it all. But for business, I think the key, exactly like Kevin said, is Annalise Dodds. She's obviously not very well known, but for Keir to put her in what is the second most important position in any shadow cabinet is a really, really important thing.
Mm-hmm. And would you expect then to be further changes later on down the line, assuming we're going to have a full 5 years of this administration? Do you think, you know, the likes of Rebecca Long-Bailey, Emily Thornberry, Kat Smith, who have been kept in there, might they change later on down the line, or would you still be assuming they're in for the long haul? Is that smart politics to be talking about, David?
Well, I'd just say you've got it. It's very difficult to predict this sort of thing. I mean, you go back to, every time you see a picture of a new shadow cabinet or a new cabinet, everybody in public affairs starts to play the game of who's going to be the first one under the bus. Mm-hmm. And you can't tell the reason why. It might not be political. It might be some personal reason, some scandal. You know, that's the point about politics. Politics is not. It's not science. It's a mixture of an awful lot of things, including luck. So who knows who will fall in and fall out? But, you know, I would imagine that as long as people adhere to collective responsibility, at least to start with, then there'll be more discipline on that from the top. Keir already emphasised that to the shadow cabinet, and I can see that being quite a serious thing if people start to break ranks.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth saying that this is not a normal time in which you would kind of normally launch a shadow cabinet. So actually quite a lot of Labour's planning is going to be relatively short term. I thought it was really interesting that the first tranche of announcements we saw for the shadow cabinet on Sunday were people who would be part of the coronavirus response. Mm-hmm. It was interesting actually that the Shadow Base secretary wasn't part of that group, and there was a lot of criticism of that, particularly from some of the unions on Sunday. But, you know, the party will be thinking through how does it position itself in the context of the coronavirus crisis? How does it continue to hold the government to account in opposition while, you know, being helpful and being as constructive as possible in a really challenging time for the country? And I think there's going to be so much focus on the next kind of 3 to 6 months. And then there's going to be much more focus on the recovery, which is where I think some of the kind of economic strengths of the Labour Party are going to come more into play.
They're quite a callow shadow cabinet, aren't they? I mean, looking at it, David, my colleague, ran some numbers off, and I think almost 50% of them only became MPs from 2015 onwards, and only a quarter of them were actually MPs during any kind of Labour government. So how might that affect the way that businesses want to engage with this shadow cabinet?
Well, there's two things to remember here. First of all, Labour's now been out of power for 10 years. So actually the number of people who have experience of being ministers has naturally kind of, it's a lot lower than it would have been even kind of when Ed Miliband was setting up his shadow cabinet. And secondly, even though some of the people who were appointed in the shadow cabinet became MPs in 2015, a couple of them in 2017, they fought 3 elections by this point. You know, we don't think of 2015 as a terribly long time ago, but actually if we think about what's changed in politics in that 4.5, 5 year period, it's been absolutely enormous. So in a sense, I wouldn't want to kind of underestimate some of the new people in the shadow cabinet. I think they are, for the most part, going to be very capable, very bright. And they're going to take to their briefs really quickly.
Yeah, and some of them have been quite senior local government leaders like Steve Reid, etc. And I would emphasise that now is a very big opportunity for public affairs people with Labour. I was just musing yesterday that I went to the Tory party conference in 2002, 2003, and that friendships and just being around and helping people then, you know, at the time I was in the nuclear industry. So going and talking to people about those issues, I've still got those friendships now, almost 20 years later. And I think this is the point. Politics is a long game. And if people help the new shadow cabinet by almost having an educational role in their industry and providing information, being seen to be helpful, the shadow cabinet doesn't have the resources of government, the civil service. And so don't expect them to be absolute experts in what you're an expert in, and urge people to engage in that spirit. And I think, you will reap what you sow.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So we see sometimes there isn't necessarily an understanding that in opposition you don't have the same resources as government does, particularly in terms of kind of policy formation. Certainly from my experience as a political advisor, I didn't have assistants and civil servants that I could draw on. I was really reliant on the House of Commons library for information, and I was actually really reliant at the time on people giving helpful factual briefings. So something for a lot of public affairs people to think through would be, what can you do to help people get up to speed if maybe they've taken on a new brief? So rather than really trying to push a particular agenda, just saying, what can we do to help? In normal times, you might want to take new members of the Shadow Cabinet out to visit some of your sites or to kind of see some of the work that you do. That's obviously slightly more challenging at the moment, and you should think about doing that virtually. But really short, sharp, concise briefings that aren't trying to push an agenda too far will go a really long way in terms of helping you build a constructive relationship with the opposition.
Exactly. I think that's the point. You're trying to build a relationship. And in that way, when you do have an ask, when you are in a bit of trouble, when you do want, a bit of help, then you can ask for it after you've built a relationship. It's never a good idea in public affairs to go into a meeting and that be the first meeting you've ever had with somebody, and then be asking for help. Can you speak in the House on this? Can you put a question down, etc. I mean, that's never a good idea, to be honest.
And how is what's happening at the moment? I mean, I've tried to steer clear of coronavirus to some extent, but it's inevitable that we have to talk about it. As you say, Christine, site visits are off for the moment, but what else can people in industry be doing to try and warm up those relationships with new members of the Shadow Cabinet?
Well, I think we're seeing at the moment from a lot of people in opposition, actually not just the Labour Party, the SNP have been really pushing it too, but they are deeply concerned about Parliament not sitting. They very much want to see kind of some form of virtual Parliament to come back after Easter so that they can, continue to hold the government to account. Mm-hmm. So actually, we're certainly seeing that opposition parliamentarians want to engage. They are all adapting to technology, so there are various things that you can do using Zoom or other kind of video conferencing platforms. You can absolutely still be thinking about events and roundtables. They might be slightly different. You might not do a dinner, for example, but things that are quite policy focused and that have an interesting hook for Labour parliamentarians, I think they will absolutely be interested in engaging with.
Yeah, I'm actually amazed at how many meetings in inverted commas are taking place with politicians. But then on another level, they're sat at home the same as everybody else, and they want to look helpful, they want to do things, and certainly at Shadow Cabinet level, certainly Jonathan Ashworth is very involved in discussions with the government on quite detailed things. And in fact, several clients recently have fed in things through Labour politicians straight into government, and it's had an effect immediately. I mean, in a way, these are very unusual times. I mean, talking about over quite serious things like who are key workers, who aren't, food production industry, that type of thing. And the relationships with Labour politicians are bearing immediate fruit, frankly. Especially, in those obviously it needs to be serious, but if it is, then it's as good a route in as any other.
Yeah, and just on that, I mean, I think we've been talking so much about Labour in opposition because we're talking about the National Party, but, you know, in various cities around England, Labour is in power, in local authorities across the country, in Wales as well. And it's really worth kind of not forgetting about that and thinking about how kind of engagement with metro mayors, for example, can help with some of your broader government relations objectives. I thought it was really interesting to see that one of the two Association of Labour councillors members on the NEC was brought in to brief the Shadow Cabinet yesterday. I think there's always been a bit of a pushback from Labour councillors saying that they're not taken seriously enough by the National Party. I think Keir Starmer is showing that he wants to do things quite differently there. So actually the role of local authority leaders may well be more important in this administration.
And of course, they're far more established and now have an additional year where they're in post as well. And then I mean, a lot of people watching this, they will have done their stakeholder mapping regarding the cabinet and the government not that long ago, really. How would you advise people tailor their message differently, and what might their different asks be of the shadow cabinet? How can they use them effectively to try and put things on the political agenda?
I would say just whatever it is you're trying to do, whatever it is you're trying to achieve, stick to your message, never get bored of it, just the classic public affairs things. I mean, these might seem like very strange times, but politics and media are both going ahead full tilt. So, you know, as we would always advise, it needs to be an overall holistic strategy of putting your message into the politicians and trying to back it up with things in the press or with events or third-party advocates, the same as ever. And I think everybody's finding new ways of operating, exactly like the whole idea of organising remote roundtables, you know, would have seemed a bit like daft, frankly, 6 months ago. Whereas now it's like, you know, it's absolutely, you know, par for the course. And that's probably never going to change. I mean, I think there will be, obviously, it's going to be nice being able to meet people, do the normal things normally when we're allowed to. But I don't think that this is ever going to go back to how it was. I think these new techniques and new ways of working are going to persist into the future.
In terms of messaging and engagement, I mean, on the biggest issue of the day, I don't think there's a huge amount of difference between where the Conservative Party is and where the Labour Party is at the moment. Everybody desperately wants to get through the coronavirus crisis with as few deaths as possible, as few hospitalizations as possible, and managing the economic impact of it as effectively as possible. So actually, I think public affairs people should be having similar conversations with both sides on that. Where you might want to play the Labour Party or opposition parties more broadly in particular, is if there's something that the government has been working on that maybe is being delayed that actually still needs to be on the agenda. So something we saw last week that was quite interesting just before Labour's reshuffle, people who work in the railway will have been expecting a white paper on rail reform, which was promised for the spring. We may not necessarily be seeing it now. We're expecting that to be delayed. But actually, Labour put out a 100-page policy paper saying what they would do if they were writing their own white paper on it. And actually, if there are other things that are kind of maybe a little bit lost, that are more business as usual, that haven't been prioritised in the context of coronavirus, actually working with the opposition to keep some of those things on the agenda so that they don't completely slip will be definitely valuable.
Yeah, that's right.
Wonderful. And then a final question from me. You've both advised either Labour MP campaigns or been political advisors. If you were advising a new shadow cabinet member or Sir Keir himself, what would you be saying they should be prioritising in the first 100 days?
Well, it's not a normal 100 days, is it? I think
I was going to say, don't cock it up. I mean, like,
absolutely.
Don't say anything stupid. Don't do anything vulgar or crass. And just try and look as statesmanlike as you can until we get to the end of this crisis. It's really unusual. And, you know, you've actually got a bit of time to work yourself into your brief, and don't try and be too clever. Just take it steady. It's a long game. They've got a majority of 5. I mean, there is a national government. I don't know whether we want to go at that, but I mean, and some people think it's more likely than others. But yeah, I personally think, you know, I can see reasons why the government would want Labour on the inside to so that everybody, the blame in terms of the economy towards the back end of all of this, when the terrible fear and sort of frankly panic subsides, the economic damage and the bill, the government will want Labour to be, you know, very well bound in there, because that's obviously where Labour can start to make a few runs if the economy doesn't start to recover quite quickly. But I would just say, just take it steady. My advice at the minute would just be careful. Do not do anything where you're just going to look vulgar or crass or out of place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a degree to which Labour could be looking back at the 1945 general election. If you look back at some of the opinion polls before that election, part of the reason why Labour managed to kind of a landslide from a previously popular kind of conservative wartime leader was that it really carefully established a reputation for competence and actually engaging with the government effectively during this crisis, showing that, you know, Labour is absolutely an alternative government in waiting effectively is going to be really, really key for doing that. But also potentially, we may well see that some of this really significant changes that are happening to our economy and to our society during the crisis may make it easier for a potential future Labour government to bring forward some of the proposals that maybe were dismissed back at the end of 2019. So at the moment, we're seeing things like temporary effective nationalisation of the railway. Now, we saw voters reject that back into the end of last year, but there may well be more interest when people have kind of seen how that works in practice. So actually, I think for the Labour Party, it will be looking like a party of government will be really key, but it may actually enable it to push through policies that have previously been perceived as kind of very left-wing, and maybe some of the more Corbynite policies, their time may still come.
That's true, and I think that's right. As soon as you saw Rishi Sunak with the big bailout package, that was like Thatcherism and Blair Brownism in terms of the economy is over. I mean, that is over. And what comes next will be the subject of an awful lot of discussion and debate. But what was previously seen as impossible became possible with him. And I think that is one of the big things that people will take out of this. And also, just remember that Gordon Brown was miles ahead in the polls at the middle of the 2008 financial crisis, as the country basically rallied behind the national leadership. And yet, 2 years later, he lost the general election. And that's the point about post-Brexit. We're now into this. Things are very, very liminal, very flexible, and Labour just needs to look sensible and statesmanlike. It doesn't need to be too clever.
Brilliant. Busy time for us all. I'm going to wrap it up there. So thank you to David Wild and also to Christine Quigley for joining me. Enjoy the rest of your birthday as well, Christine.
Yeah, happy birthday, Christine.
We will be publishing a briefing on the Labour Shadow Cabinet and some of Sir Keir Starmer's backroom team as well. So watch out for that either today or tomorrow. Thank you again to our guests, and we hope to see you again soon.